have been doing a brief study of theology, looking at classic texts as well as giving great theological themes in Scripture. We have looked at bibliology, we've looked at theology proper, natural and spatial revelation. We have viewed cosmology, anthropology, and now we're looking at Christology. We just finished the covenants on a previous video, the Hebrew Old Testament covenants, the Abrahamic, the Davidic, and the New, and how Christ fulfills them. Now I would like to continue looking at the divine attributes of our Lord Jesus Christ in his eternality and his divinity. And I'd like to look at those attributes now. When we look at the Hebrew Bible, we go back to Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, and we have what is called the great I am text. When Moses, for example, in chapter 3 of Exodus, verse 13, said, "What is the name that I should say unto the children of Israel, who has sent me?" And God said to Moses, "I am that which I am." And he said, "This is what you should say to the children of Israel: I am has sent me unto you." The Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I am that which I am. No beginning, no ending. God just is. And that is what Jesus is saying, looking at his eternality. That is what God is saying to Moses at that point. As I look at the New Testament, we have a referencing back to that Exodus 3 text, or at least referred to several times. I think we need to go to John 8, verse 58, where Jesus makes the statement to those that were questioning him: "Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am." Ego eimi in the Greek. So he uses the very same terms that Yahweh used of himself, showing again his claim to eternality. A great text, John 8:58. In John chapter 1, we also have the Word, which refers to Jesus, who was in the beginning. By the way, when John uses the word, logos, I believe that he is coming from a Jewish background, which takes us back to the Memra, the Aramaic, Targum, Aramaic translation of Genesis 1, often uses the word or Memra in Aramaic. It will read, for example, God said, and then in the next verse, the Memra said. So again, I think John, referring back to that truth about Jesus being co-equal with God, being co-eternal, and so forth, begins John 1, in the beginning was the Word. And the Greek, ein, shows eternal existence. He didn't have a beginning. He didn't come to be, John says, but he was. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was literally pros ton theon, face to face with God, and the Word was God. And all things subsequently then were made by him. So he is eternal. We also have a reference to the eternality of the Lord in Psalm 45, applied to Christ in the New Testament, along with Psalm 102. Psalm 45 reads, it's a wedding psalm, but in the midst of it, it reads, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of righteousness. because you've loved righteousness and hated wickedness, therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your contemporaries. That text is applied by the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 1, verses 8 to 12, along with Psalm 102, a psalm that is talking about God's eternality. And the psalmist is praying that the Lord would allow him to stay alive to see God bringing Israel back to the promised land from the Babylonian captivity. And it reads this way in verses 26 and 27. Lord, you look at the heavens and they perish, but you shall endure. All of them shall wax old like a garment, and as a clothing, a piece of clothing or a vesture, you shall change them, and they shall be changed. And yet you're the same, and your years have no end. What I think is striking to me, when you take these two texts together and look at it in terms of Hebrews chapter 1, verses 8 to 12, through the pen of divine inspiration, the writer of Hebrews is taking both of these texts and applying it over the board to Jesus Christ. And so Psalm 102 is clearly talking about Yahweh, talking about God, Elohim. And now the same phraseology is applied directly to Jesus Christ in Hebrews 1, 8 to 12, along with your throne, O God, is forever and ever. And here the writer of Hebrews is clearly speaking of Jesus as God, hence the eternal, divine being who is co-equal with God the Father. It is also interesting that Jesus makes the claim in John 14, verse 6. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. Only the divine Son could make these claims, that no one can come to the Father except through me. Furthermore, Jesus is sovereign over all things. He is the creator of all things. We see that in John 1, verse 3. When we go to Colossians, a great Christological text is Colossians chapter 1. And when we look at that text, it reads like this, speaking of Christ, that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. For by him were all things created. All things, we're told, were created by him and for him in verse 16. And in verse 17, he is before all things, and all things hold together in him or consist in him. So again, we're seeing the sovereignty of Jesus Christ co-equal with God the Father as the creator of all things. And when he says he is the firstborn of every creature, it is interesting that the word prototokos in the Greek, firstborn, needs to be understood from the Hebrew scriptures and the Septuagint. It is interesting when you go back to Psalm 89, verse 28, that God has made the coming king, Messiah, the firstborn. And then you have a definition of that, the highest of the kings of the earth. So here we have a Hebrew, can I say, parallelism, showing that the term firstborn simply means one who is the highest, the sovereign of all kings. It doesn't mean there was a time when he was born. It means he is the sovereign. Like the firstborn of a household is the kingpin, so to speak, the sovereign one. So what the psalmist is saying here is that Messiah, Jesus, is the firstborn, and then defining that as the highest of the kings of the earth, or one who is totally sovereign over all things. That's what firstborn means. Then Jesus is also omnipotent. It is interesting in the Great Commission, Matthew 28, 16 to 20, we see his omnipotence. Notice Jesus makes the statement in verse 18 of that text, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth, showing his total omnipotence. He's all powerful in that Great Commission. Furthermore, we see that again defined in John 1, verses 3 and following. He is equal with God in John 1, and all things were made by him. And without him was not anything made that was made. So he's the, can I say, the architect of creation. And to create, he's equal with God. And so he is all powerful in John 1 as well. And then he's not only omnipotent, but he's also omniscient. That is, he's all-knowing. He supernaturally, for example, saw Nathanael under a fig tree, and Jesus knew what was in his heart. And to know this, he had to be all-knowing. Furthermore, he heals a nobleman's son at a distance, and the son, and knows that he is healed. It'd be like miles away, he's saying at this very time, your son is healed, and it's done. So he's all omniscient, he's all knowing. For example, in John 1:48, before Philip called you, Jesus said, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. And yet he wasn't there, but he was there in his all knowledge. Furthermore, in John 2, we're told, verse 24, that Jesus did not need anyone, anyone who would testify of man, for he knew what was in man, all knowing again, knowing what's even the thoughts of humankind. Furthermore, in John 4, and we had alluded to the nobleman's son, he told the nobleman that his son was healed. Go your way, your son lives. He had come to Jesus. And when the nobleman went back, they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. So the father, the nobleman of the son, knew that it was at that same hour, verse 53 of John 4, that Jesus said to him, your son lives. And he himself then believed in all his house. He knew that Jesus was all-knowing, that he was divine in his attribute of omniscience. Furthermore, he is omnipresent. Omnipresent means he's everywhere. For example, in Matthew 18:20, we're told, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name, he is there. And it's interesting, in the rabbinic literature, wherever 2 or 3 are studying Torah, the Shekhinah join them. Here Christ joins us when we study with 2 or 3. It is interesting, the Shekhinah in the Torah is referring to God's presence himself. So Jesus is claiming omnipresence wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together. I'd like to say, I think that's important to understand, even from a personal application point of view. We need to realize that we're just a few are gathered together worshiping the Lord. He is there, and he joins them and appreciates that worship. We put such an emphasis on what is mega or huge a lot of times, where Jesus is saying, where 2 or 3 are together studying in my name, I join them. Matthew 18:20. Furthermore, he is full of grace and truth. Psalm 117 in speaking of Yahweh, says his merciful kindness is great toward us, and the truth of the Lord endures forever. Those twin concepts of grace and truth are applied by Jesus and to Jesus. For example, in John 1, Christ, John tells us, is full of grace and truth as the Son of God. And we see Jesus claiming to be the way, the truth, and the life, claiming to bring full grace to those that respond to him. So when we look at all of this, we can certainly say Jesus is divine in his omnipotence, his omniscience, his omnipresence, his eternality, his absolute sovereignty. And so he is worthy of worship. It's interesting in Psalm 102, which is applied directly to Christ. It says in verse 10, "You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They shall perish, but you remain. They shall all wax old as a garment." And so what is interesting here, this very text, and we've already alluded to this, is looking at Jesus as the co-creator with God the Father, and the writer of Hebrews applied that over the board to Christ as the one who is eternal. Everything else is perishing, but as God the Father is eternal, so God the Son is eternal. And furthermore, we see in his resurrection that he is worthy of worship. He's conquered death. And in John 20, verse 28, the words of Thomas should be applied by all of us when he came to Jesus as the resurrected Lord and said, "My Lord and my God." And it's interesting, Jesus said, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are they who have not seen and yet have believed." And that's a blessing on all today who have not physically seen the resurrected Christ, but through the eyes of faith have seen and believed. I'm also struck by the great text of Revelation 5, 9, and 14, where Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And he is worthy to receive the book, the sealed book, for he was slain and he has redeemed a kingdom of priests, or created a kingdom of redeemed priests, and hence is worthy of worship. As I read that text, it says, "Every creature in heaven," verse 13 of chapter 5, "and on earth and under the earth, and such as are in the sea and all that is in them, I heard saying, blessing and honor and glory and power be unto him who sits upon the throne and unto the Lamb forever and ever." So Jesus, who has created a kingdom of priests who will reign on the earth in Revelation 5, verse 10, by having accomplished this through the redemption that he has created, so that he has redeemed us to God by his blood out of every kindred, tongue, people, and nation. And as a result, he is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who is worthy of our worship. He's worthy of the worship from all the angelic beings of heaven that worship him, and all beings on earth. And may we bow down before Jesus as the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and as the psalmist says, kiss the Son, for he indeed is worthy of our worship.